Many years ago, when I was a relatively new faculty member at the University of Lethbridge, I attended a party hosted by the Faculty of Graduate Studies for those of us who were supervising MA students, as I was at the time. I fell to talking with one of the University of Lethbridge's famous researchers, a man who shall remain nameless, but who was and still is one of the most respected and prominent scientists on the faculty. When he discovered that I was a relatively recent hire in the English department, he seemed amused. "What do you do in an English class?" he asked me. "Do you talk about how much you like the books? What more can there be to say?" I don't think he meant to be flippant or mean-spirited. He seemed genuinely puzzled, if a little disdainful, as if he could not imagine what there was in a novel that might be worth talking about for a full class period. And I was just as puzzled that what seemed to me the most fascinating, vital, all-encompassing, intellectually stimulating, and aesthetically fulfilling discipline in the world, namely the study of literature, should be the subject of such ignorance and wry bemusement. I've waited nearly 20 years to answer the question of what we English professors do when we teach our students, and now I have my chance. Because I'm sure that my colleague's bewilderment was not unique, and there may be many people who do not know what it means to study literature at the university level. So I thought that what I would do in the next 40 or so minutes available to me would be to show you what, in fact, we English professors do during the course of one of our lectures. Since one of the problems of teaching a literary text is that in order to discuss it, you need people who have read or are familiar with it, I cast about for something that would fulfill that requirement. And I did not have to think too hard before I came up with what is probably the most widely known work by my favorite novelist, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. One reason I thought of Dickens was that his fiction still remains a part of our cultural landscape. Just think of the TV commercial of a few years ago that claimed that Canadian Tire lets you give like Santa and save like Scrooge. And some of you may remember Walt Disney's Scrooge McDuck. Then there are the stage productions of the carol every year at Christmas time. So I was reasonably sure that everyone in this room would have at least a passing acquaintance with A Christmas Carol, even if you have not actually read Dickens's text. Furthermore, as I'm sure you all know, Christmas is just around the corner. So I thought this would be timely, and in other words, it would be a perfect choice. I first fell in love with Dickens when I was an undergraduate. My BA is from a small college in Vermont called Bennington College. Bennington had a work-study program, and one year I got a job in New York City as a copy girl for Women's Wear Daily, the newspaper that is often called the Bible of New York's fashion industry. I was young, I had very little money, and I knew no one in New York. And exciting though the city is, it can be awfully lonely when you have limited resources and don't know a soul. Fortunately, across the street from my apartment, there was a bookshop, and there I would spend most of my free time and disposable income. And it was there that I first picked up a novel by Charles Dickens. The novel was Great Expectations. I swallowed that book whole, truly in one enchanted gulp. It would not be an exaggeration to say that I fell in love, then and there, with the author and his work, and especially with the extraordinary inventiveness of his mind that still gives me endless delight, and with his use of language and his idiosyncratic construction of sentences. To this day, although I've read through all of Dickens several times, I still get great pleasure out of just reading a Dickens sentence. From Great Expectations, I went on to read Bleak House, and after that, anything else by Dickens that I could get my hands on. It would be fair to say that those 3 months that I spent in New York City were life-altering for me because they put me on the track to my future career, namely to becoming an English professor with a specialty in 19th century literature and especially in the work of Charles Dickens. So I tried to lure you here with a familiar text and a snappy title that suggests that Dickens invented Christmas. Of course, Dickens did not invent Christmas. The roots of Christmas as a holiday go back to pagan times. But Dickens was responsible for putting this holiday back on the map of public awareness, since by the late 18th century, Christmas had become a holiday primarily of the lower classes and was largely ignored by anyone with a claim to gentility. Since Dickens himself came from a lower class family, his father was a naval clerk and his mother came from a family that was in service to an earl, his family celebrated Christmas when he was a child. So he knew the holiday well and he loved it. In the 1840s, Dickens wrote 5 Christmas books for the holiday market. So he established a tradition of specialized holiday stories all by himself. And it is A Christmas Carol that secured the link between his name and the holiday in the popular mind. So much so that according to one anecdote, when he died, a pushcart girl in Covent Gardens burst into tears because she thought that Father Christmas had died and that there would be no more Christmases thereafter. In fact, today's common greeting of Merry Christmas only came into wide circulation after the publication of A Christmas Carol. The plot of this very long short story draws on the tradition in Britain of telling ghost stories at Christmas time. A Christmas Carol is a ghost story with a fairy tale ending. The main character is a miserly capitalist named Scrooge, who treats his workers badly, refuses to give to charity, and never celebrates Christmas, which he characterizes as humbug. Scrooge is brought to see the error of his ways by 3 ghosts who represent the past, the present, and the future. The ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge back to his lonely childhood, where we are shown the roots of his avaricious character. The ghost of Christmas present shows Scrooge the miserable conditions in which some of his countrymen live in the present. The ghost of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge the lonely, unmourned death he will die if he does not mend his ways, and soon. In order to bring home this cautionary message, the ghost takes Scrooge to visit the home of his poor, much put upon employee, Bob Cratchit, whom Scrooge, in the name of maximizing profits, has habitually mistreated. Bob Cratchit is the father of a crippled, sickly, but always cheerful little boy named Tiny Tim. In the company of the ghost of Christmas yet to come, Scrooge visits Bob Cratchit's home only to find that Tiny Tim has died. Dickens was, and still is, often accused of being cloyingly sentimental, especially in indulging a fondness for describing the deaths of children, Tiny Tim being a case in point. This fondness caused Oscar Wilde to come up with the witticism that one must have a heart of stone to read the death of Tiny Tim without laughing. It is certainly true that the Victorians had a weakness for the pathetic and for the kind of easy tears that could be evoked by the untimely deaths of children. However, it is also true that there was a high mortality rate of children of all classes in the 19th century, so that literary descriptions of their deaths touched a nerve. So to counter Oscar Wilde's witticism, I will quote from the Queen of Norway, who famously said that no one can be really bad who who can cry over the death of Tiny Tim. The ghostly trips to the past, the present, and the future do wonders for Scrooge's personality, which undergoes a change almost as drastic and quite as unbelievable as if Donald Trump went to bed one night and woke up the next morning as Hillary Clinton. From being a mean old codger, Scrooge becomes a broad-hearted, generous philanthropist. Bob Cratchit's crippled son, Tiny Tim, in fact, does not die, and Scrooge visits his nephew Fred to celebrate the holiday, an invitation he had initially refused. As in all fairy tales, everything ends happily with good cheer all around. Tiny Tim gets the last words. "God bless us, everyone," he says, thereby injecting one of the few overtly religious elements into this otherwise quite secular tale. A Christmas Carol was an instant success, provoking an outpouring of Yuletide conviviality across all classes, which has not diminished into our own time. As I said, it has become a cultural icon with few parallels, although ironically, this tale of a miser was written because its author was in dire need of money. He had been losing readers as a result of poor sales of Martin Chuzzlewit, the novel he was then serializing in the popular press. And to add irony to irony, although A Christmas Carol was an enormous success from the very beginning, with its initial 6,000 copies being snapped up within days of publication, Dickens actually lost money on it because he had decided to pay for the publication himself and then lavished so much care on its production, including a Moroccan leather jacket, that his profits were eaten up. It's the Moroccan. Nor for all the fact that today we think of A Christmas Carol as a warm-hearted fairy tale that champions good cheer, generosity, and conviviality at Christmas time, and suggests that even the most ornery, stingy, and bad-tempered among us can be redeemed. Despite this perception, the truth is that A Christmas Carol is a product of one of the worst recessions in 19th century British history. A time called the Hungry 40s, a period of high unemployment and widespread poverty, brought about and exacerbated by unregulated laissez-faire capitalism that increased the economic hardships of the working class, the poor, and the indigent. In fact, the heart of the story, the kernel out of which it grew, is the scene at the end of Stave 3, when the ghost of Christmas Present parts his robes to reveal what Scrooge originally thinks is a foot or a claw. "It might be a claw for all the flesh there is on it," says the ghost, but it actually turns out to belong to one of two children, a boy and a girl, who are described by Dickens as yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. They represent the underbelly of Victorian society, the desperate poverty lying hidden beneath the outer robes of respectable middle-class Victorian prosperity. To Dickens's credit, he resists the temptation to prettify these children. There is nothing likable, cute, or pathetic about them because they are so thoroughly miserable. Little wonder then that the boy represents ignorance and the girl want. Their unprepossessing countenances confront Scrooge with the reality of a shared humanity, whether he wants to admit it or not. In fact, we know that the inspiration for the carol had grown out of Dickens's visit a few months earlier to a ragged school, which was what the Victorians called charity schools for poor children. The sight of the children's wretchedness had completely unnerved Dickens, and it had outraged him. He declared in a letter that he wanted to strike a sledgehammer blow on behalf of the poor man's child. It was this sense of outrage at the indifference of Victorian society to the needs of its most vulnerable inhabitants that fueled the creative impulse behind A Christmas Carol. And if you want to see some examples, there are many, many pictures of the street children of the time. Another one. What made this fuel burn even brighter was Dickens's own brush with injustice and poverty when he was a child. When Dickens was 12 years old, his father went bankrupt. Bankruptcy in the 19th century was considered a crime, punishable by being put in debtor's prison. The most famous or infamous bankruptcy prison of this time was called the Marshalsea. If you think about it, this form of punishment for non-payment of debt made very little sense because you could not pay off your creditors while you were sitting in jail. So no one was made whole, not the person owing the money and not those to whom it was owed. In any case, the fact that Dickens's father, along with the rest of his family, was imprisoned in the Marshalsea had a profound effect on the life of the young Dickens, who, since he was the eldest son, found himself at age 12 living alone in London and forced to work at a bootblacking factory called Warren's, where his job was to paste labels onto pots of blacking, which was a kind of paste used to polish boots. What made matters worse was that he was obliged to do this work in front of a large window so that the people passing on the street could look in and witness his humiliation. Dickens's father was eventually bailed out of prison by the timely death of a relative who left him an inheritance, which allowed him to pay off his debts. So in the end, the young Dickens worked in the blacking factory for only a few months. To put Dickens's experience as a boy in perspective, I should tell you that the early 19th century was a period of unregulated and extensive child labor, and it was not at all unusual for children as young as 5 or 6, both girls and boys, to be working in the mines or in the factories from before dawn until late at night. Many died as they worked, and many more lost limbs, fingers, toes, to the machines with which they worked, or sickened from sweeping chimneys or inhaling the cotton dust in the factories. By comparison, Dickens's experience at Warren's bootblacking factory was relatively mild. He was not beaten, nor was his work particularly unhealthy. But he always felt that he had been cast aside and neglected by his parents, that he had been forced to grow up too soon, that he had been humiliated by having others watch him while he worked with other boys whom he considered his social inferiors. It all left a mark on his soul. In fact, he was so traumatized by this episode that he never forgot it. Mention of Warren's blacking factory occurs in almost every one of his novels, often as a kind of coded allusion. It is what accounts for Fagin and the boy thieves in Oliver Twist, for Joe the crossing sweep in Bleak House, the Micawbers in David Copperfield, the terrifying convict who rises up from among the gravestones in Great Expectations to frighten the poor boy Pip, and all those other poor, neglected, old before their time children who peopled Dickens's novels. It is also the autobiographical spring that accounts for Dickens's social conscience, a social conscience that is certainly on display in A Christmas Carol. In A Christmas Carol, Dickens gives us 2 explanations for why the adult Scrooge is a greedy miser. One is psychological and the other is social. If you remember, when the ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge back to his childhood, we learn how lonely and neglected Scrooge was as a child. His increasing avariciousness as he grows older can therefore be seen as a psychological defense against the fear of loss. an impulse to hoard money, because unlike humans, money can never abandon nor harm him emotionally. By having the ghost of Christmas past take Scrooge back to revisit his childhood, Dickens is anticipating Freud's perception that one way to lay to rest the ghosts of the past, and I use the word ghosts advisedly, is to revisit them, and so try to come to terms with them. But if Dickens explains Scrooge's miserliness in psychological terms, he also explains it in social terms. What is most important to know about Scrooge is that his stinginess, his unwillingness to give to charity, his greed, his exploitation of his employee, his resistance to making mankind, rather than financial gain, his business, make him an ideal exemplar of the laissez-faire capitalist ideology of his time. In other words, Scrooge is not an anomaly. Scrooge believes that if he pays taxes to maintain prisons and workhouses, then he has fulfilled his obligation to the common welfare. When Scrooge replies to the charity men who have come seeking donations for the poor with the rhetorical questions, are there no prisons? And the union workhouses, are they still in operation? The treadmill and the poor law, are they in full vigor? He is alluding to the social abuses of the time. The workhouses were the product of the Poor Law Act of 1834, utilitarianism's unfortunate solution for poverty, which forced the poor into workhouses where they were required to work at often useless tasks in exchange for food and shelter, and whose purpose was to make life in the workhouse so miserable that only the most desperate would want to go there. Dickens hated the Poor Law Act and campaigned vigorously against it, including in his novels, especially Oliver Twist. When Scrooge is told that conditions in the workhouses are so terrible that the poor often refuse to go there, preferring death instead, Scrooge replies, if they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. The reference to the surplus population is a dig at Thomas Malthus, the author of an essay on the principle of population, which warned that unchecked population growth would eventually outstrip the food supply, thus leading to mass starvation. Like utilitarianism, Malthus was one of Dickens's bête noire, and he campaigned ceaselessly to discredit Malthus's ideas. Where one sees this campaign most clearly in A Christmas Carol is in the celebration of joyous, unlimited human reproduction. When the ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge to revisit his past self, we are shown a scene in which Scrooge's former fiancée, who is now a comely matron, is sitting with her own daughter in a house surrounded by her many other children. The noise in the room was perfectly tumultuous, the narrator says. There were not 40 children conducting themselves like one, and every child was conducting itself like 40. This is followed by a scene in Bob Cratchit's poor home with its 6 children. The ghost then takes Scrooge on a trip to where miners live, and we peer inside a hut with walls made of mud and stone, where the cheerful company consists of an old man and woman with their children and children's children, and another generation beyond that, all of them celebrating Christmas. Finally, at the end, when Scrooge visits his nephew Fred, he's confronted by Fred's wife, his niece by marriage, who is significantly pregnant. All these allusions to fertility, to joyous and unconstrained human reproduction are meant, on the one hand, to contrast the two forms of breeding, the sterile breeding of money that Scrooge engages in, and the implied love and pleasure that go with breeding children within marriage. But it is also meant to undermine and discredit the Malthusian dictum about decreasing the surplus population. The surplus population was generally understood to be the children of the poor, and the poor themselves were thought to be irresponsible breeders of offspring, whom they could not care for, and thus foisted on society as an unacceptable burden. That is why the workhouses of the time tried to impose sexual abstinence on the indigent by separating the men and women who went there for relief, even when they were lawfully married to one another. By asserting the fact that the children of the poor are as vital to the well-being of society as the children of the rich, that they bring joy to their parents, that a profusion of children is inherently a good thing because it points to an investment in the future, Dickens was writing against the grain of contemporary ideology that blamed the poor for their poverty and defined them as profligate in their sexual indulgence. In case we miss the point, Dickens has the ghost spell it out for us as he lectures Scrooge. Forbear that wicked cant about the surplus population until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Dickens, incidentally, practiced what he preached. He loved profusion, and he was a prolific author of 15 novels and 10 children, all but one of whom grew to adulthood. By the time he is writing A Christmas Carol, 4 of his children have been born, and his wife was pregnant with the 5th. When he was younger and his children were few, fatherhood seemed to him a rather pleasant state. But as time went on and his wife was continually pregnant, and this is her as a young woman and what happened after she gave birth to her 10 children, she was continually pregnant and she was worn out while still a young woman. Dickens found himself forced to provide for an ever-increasing brood. His appreciation of the supposed joys of limitless fatherhood underwent a sea change. Of his 9 children who survived to adulthood, 7 were boys. And these boys he sent off to various parts of the empire as soon as they were old enough to be gainfully employed. In fact, one of his sons came to Canada and served in the Northwest Mounted Police before dying at age 42 of heart failure, probably brought on by alcoholism. This son, Francis Dickens, was actually posted at Fort Macleod for a time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Dickens was only 31 when he wrote A Christmas Carol, and a profusion of things could still send him into paroxysms of delight. I won't list all the descriptions in A Christmas Carol that evoke the joy that exists in abundance. But I would point you to the street scene in Stave 3, where Dickens lists all the goodies that are available for sale on a London street at Christmas time, including onions. Here is what Dickens says about the onions. There were ruddy, brown-faced, broad-girthed Spanish onions, shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking from their shelves in wanton slyness at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely up at the hung-up mistletoe. Who but Dickens could imagine lecherous onions? And apropos of onions, Dickens loves to describe food. For instance, this passage from about Mrs. Cratchit's pudding. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. Mrs. Cratchit entered with the pudding, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quart of ignited brandy, and bedecked with Christmas holly stuck onto the top. Personally, I'm not sure that I would want to eat a pudding that was hard and firm like a cannonball, but there can be no doubt about the pleasure Dickens takes in describing it. And who but Dickens could describe a pudding as smelling like a laundry? There is a reason for the laundry smell, and it goes beyond mere playfulness on Dickens's part. The pudding smells like a washing day because puddings were cooked in a cloth, which meant that there was no need for an oven, something very few poor households had. Also, puddings required very little fat, which also made them ideal holiday fare for poor families. Similarly, for the main course of their Christmas dinner, the Cratchits eat goose, which was cheaper and more readily available in 19th century England than turkey. In Victorian England, even the food one ate for the holidays was a matter of class distinction. It is not an accident that when Scrooge wakes up reformed, he sends the largest turkey he can find to the Cratchits for their Christmas feast. Turkey was an expensive bird in 19th century England. These descriptions of food may give you some idea of what I love about Dickens, namely the extraordinary inventiveness of his mind that can depict the inanimate world as if it were alive, so that we are in a realm where onions, puddings, furniture, buildings, gateways, bedposts, door knockers all seem to have a life of their own. And this ability to animate an entire world of objects and people is married to an instinctive literary sensibility, so that more often than not, we are given information simply through the rhythm of the prose. Let me show you what I mean. When the ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge back to his youth, we are given a description of a ball held at the home of Mr. Fezziwig, who was Scrooge's employer when Scrooge was a young man. And I'm going to read the text. In came a fiddler with a music book and tuned his fiddle like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook with her brother's particular friend, the milkman. In came the boy from over the way, trying to hide behind the girl from next door. In they all came, one after the other, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, anyhow and everyhow. And away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half round and back again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place. New top couple starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at once and not a bottom one to help them. And when old Mr. Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had gone all through the dance, advance and retire, hold hands with your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs and came down on his feet again without a stagger. I do not have time to read the entire passage, although it really begs to be read, but I think that I've read enough to make clear how remarkably successful Dickens is here in conveying the exuberant joy of the dance, as well as its rhythm. The pulsating beat of this passage allows the language to evoke the movement of the dancers, thereby illustrating the positive aspect of dance, its joyous, life-affirming qualities that are meant to stand as a rebuke to Scrooge's unhealthy, miserly, anti-life philosophy. The Fezziwig's ball is not only a model of healthy exertion, led by a man, Mr. Fezziwig, who is described as being both old and yet vigorous enough and skillful enough to be able to cut. A cut is a leap into the air while alternating the position of the legs, and then return to the ground without a stagger. But the dance is also a model of social equality, allowing all to join in and be top couples at the last. The dance erases social distinctions. Apprentices, housemaids, bakers, milkmen, all dance on equal terms with their employer and patron, Mr. Fezziwig, and with his family. In this way, the passage suggests that dance is good for the body politic in the same way as it is good for the individual body, that it promotes health and harmony through promoting pleasure and good feeling towards one's fellow humans. But the ball, like all good things, must come to an end, and with it, the fantasy of a harmonious society that was actually just an illusion evoked by the ghost. We and Scrooge come back to a less joyful reality. And here I come to the quarrel that I've always had with this charming fairy tale and with Dickens's conclusion of it. Because despite my prejudice in their favor, I have to admit that great writers do not always make great social thinkers. They may be excellent at describing problems, but the solutions they offer do not necessarily make sense. So in the penultimate stage 4 of A Christmas Carol, the ghost of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge a lonely grave that turns out to be his own. And it shows him the indifference with which his death will be greeted by those who knew him in life. No one mourns for him. No one is sorry that he is gone. Ironically, in death, Scrooge finally benefits the poor. His bed linen and curtains are stolen by his charwoman. His shirt is taken from his body and sold. Scrooge is horrified by what he sees and takes the lesson to heart, promising the spirit that from now on, he will honor the spirit of Christmas in his heart and try to keep it all year round. When he awakens next morning, Scrooge is a changed man. He is exuberant and he is generous. He orders the largest turkey to be sent to Bob Cratchit's house. He raises Bob Cratchit's wages, becomes a second father to Tiny Tim. Scrooge goes out into the street, and instead of saying, "Bah, humbug," to all the cheerful faces he sees, he instead wishes everyone a Merry Christmas. He finds the gentlemen to whose charity collections he had earlier refused to contribute and promises them large donations. He goes to church, pats children on the head, talks to beggars, peers into kitchens and up at windows, just for the sheer joy of it. Finally, he takes up his nephew Fred's invitation and spends Christmas with Fred and his pregnant young wife. And all this because of one night's bad sleep. So what is the moral of the story? Is it that nightmares are good for the soul? Is it that you had better love your neighbor before it is too late? Is being visited by ghosts really the solution for the kind of poverty that the Victorians saw all around them? Is the philanthropy of one individual at one time of year really a remedy for social inequality and hardship? Is the solution to the problem of ignorance and want really to be found in a ghostly threesome that, as A Christmas Carol itself suggests, are only a bad dream? Are these make-believe phantoms really the ideal guides to show us the error of our selfish ways? What I'm saying is that the story seems to espouse a kind of benevolent paternalism as a solution to deplorable economic and social conditions. It implies that if one gives to charity, does right by one's employees, and celebrates Christmas, then all will be well with the world. It implies that selfishness is something human beings can be frightened out of, that human nature is essentially redeemable, and that it is always possible to correct one's mistakes in life. Perhaps I'm being a bit of a Scrooge myself, but I find these assumptions questionable, especially today in the age of Trump. However, I don't want to end on a negative note. The second part of my title for this talk implies that it matters whether or not we believe that Dickens invented Christmas. By that I mean that it matters that we continue to read and study great writers and great literature. The reason is not that the writers will necessarily show us the way out of our problems, but that they will frame the questions we need to ask in such a way as to force us to think about them, and by thinking, perhaps fix them. At the same time, they can confer on us enormous aesthetic and intellectual pleasure, as well as a sense of wonder at the extraordinary range of the human imagination. In that sense, Shelley was right, and writers are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Reading and the academic study of literature have fallen under a cloud recently, as has the study of the humanities in general. It is devalued in a world that privileges technology and worships science, where finding the time to sit down and immerse yourself in a good book is becoming harder and harder, especially given the competition from computers, tablets, videos, movies, and television. I hope that tonight I've given you at least some small taste of the treasures we are losing when we stop reading. Thank you.